talking about Socrates' claim that in a just city, there would be basically two types of people. First, there would be a class of people who are especially qualified to guide others, to lead others, and to educate others. Socrates called this class the guardians. Socrates then had a second class of persons who I've been calling everybody else. These people are specially qualified to produce things, to distribute things, and to consume things. And their basic function is economic. So this is the big division in a just city. And as you can see here, there's a kind of division of roles or a division of jobs in a just city. The question naturally arises, how are you going to tell who's qualified to do what kind of job? And this question brings us to the question of education. So this is a slide I didn't get to last time around, so let me talk about it pretty quickly before getting to book 4. So the first thing education will do is try and sort people out and basically make sure that the people who are best qualified to rule or lead are being slotted into that guardian class. And those who are best suited or qualified to produce and exchange things are being slotted into that everybody else class, that economic class. The second thing education is supposed to do is it's supposed to enhance what is already present as a potential, especially within the guardian class. More simply, education for the guardians is supposed to develop their special qualifications, to develop their skills, to develop, in a word, their expertise. There's a broader theory of education at work in book 3, which is all about the educational practices of a just city. So I'm actually going to lean on the Latin word for education rather than the Greek word for education, because I think, well, for one reason, our word education comes from the Latin. The verb there is educere, rather than the Greek. So I think this Latin word actually captures Socrates' thought a little bit better, and it's more familiar. So why don't we go with the Latin? To educate for the ancient Greeks and for the ancient Romans meant to lead out or to bring forth. What were these ancient Greco-Roman educators trying to bring out? They were trying to bring out qualities or characteristics of one's soul. And the reason they thought of it as a kind of bringing out is they thought they were inherent qualities in everybody's soul, and that some people were better qualified to do certain things than others, more or less by birth. So they're tapping into notions here of what we would call gifts or talents. Okay, so not everyone is going to have the same gift for philosophy, for example. Not everyone's going to have the same talent, the same kind of, let's say, physical talents to be a soldier. That's the idea. And so the job of the educator is to actualize what is already potential in a young person's soul. The educator is supposed to bring out or cultivate certain excellences or virtues of the soul. And there were many virtues of the soul according to the ancient Greeks and Romans, and we'll talk some more about what those virtues would be. But for now, let's just say that the purpose of education in the ancient Mediterranean world was definitely moral. It was moral education that Socrates is really most concerned with. So when you see Socrates talking about any kind of education, including physical education, it's always with an eye towards what is being cultivated in the soul. So if he's talking about what these young children in the Just City are going to be learning about in the gymnasium, for example, you'll notice things like moral qualities, like self-discipline, like having control over your body, like being able to get up early. All those kinds of practices develop character, according to Socrates. And similarly, when you see Socrates talking about what we would consider a kind of artistic education, education in the arts, once again, what Socrates is really after is an artistic education as a kind of moral education. So Socrates, for example, talks a lot about poetry in book book 3 of the Republic. And poetry, back then for the ancient Greeks, was a very encompassing category. So not just love poems or poems about nature would have counted as poetry. If you went to the theater to watch a tragic play, that's the frowny mask, in the representation of the theater masks, there's a frowny mask. Or if you went to the theater to watch a comedy, and that's the smiley mask in the representation of the theater. That too would have been poetry, and the writers of those comedies and tragedies would have been called poets. And there's another category of things that would have counted as poetry in Socrates' discussion. You'll notice he talks about epic poems, these big adventure stories like Homer's Iliad, that's Iliad, Homer's Iliad, or Homer's Odyssey, as kinds of poetry. And these poems would have been recited, they would have been memorized, they would have been played with music. Young school children would have pretended they were characters in these big adventure stories. These are war stories and wandering stories and so forth. Classics of Greek literature. So Socrates is most concerned about what kind of morals are these poems teaching. And he doesn't want the guardians having their characters malformed because they've been reciting too much, basically bad poetry. Bad, not in the sense of it doesn't rhyme, but bad in the sense of its moral lessons are all wrong. So, for example, we remember one of the primary purposes of being a guardian, one of the primary functions of being a guardian is to guard the city, both in a moral sense and in a physical sense. So to be a kind of moral educator on the one hand, but also to be a kind of soldier or warrior on the other hand. If you're a guardian and you're trying to play the part of a warrior, do you want your warriors to be learning that death is the greatest of all possible evils, that death is to be avoided at all costs, that the most important thing about your life is preserving your individual life and that nothing is worth sacrificing for? Socrates would say, absolutely not. That's the wrong kind of lesson. And instead of making a brave soldier, you will come out with cowardly soldiers. So it's very important not to portray the underworld. This is the Greek notion of the afterlife. They called it Hades. It's very important not to portray the underworld as a kind of gloomy place where former soldiers mope around talking about how much better life was in the regular world, in their previous life. Socrates' question would be very easy. It would be, how do you know that? How do you know that the afterlife is such a bad place? How do you know that this life is way better than the next? Has anybody come from the afterlife and told you directly? What evidence do you have for this portrait of Hades? And Socrates' point would be, you don't really know that. You have to realize what you don't know. And so these portraits of a gloomy afterlife aren't, strictly speaking, true. Which is just another way of saying that for Socrates, the value of the arts is that they shape character, and they shape character in the right way when they express truth. So this is a strange way of thinking about it. These stories aren't literally true or literally false. Socrates realized when the Greek myths, for example, were talking about the gods, that the gods were really representations of moral qualities. Socrates didn't think you could climb up Mount Olympus, where the gods were reputed to live. Mount Olympus was an actual mountain, uh, and just say hello to Zeus and Hera and the other Greek gods. He didn't think they were literally up there on a mountain and so forth. But he would say what the gods were supposed to represent were kind of moral truths or moral qualities. So he was not a literalist when it came to these Greek myths. And you can't shape the right character if you haven't got true stories. That's the basic idea. And we'll come back to this question of true stories in a minute. But for now, let's just wrap up with this education section by saying what you'll notice is Socrates thinks that morality is based on knowledge. And the way you transmit that knowledge, the way you let that knowledge have an imprint on the student's soul, is by having the right kind of education system set up. Okay, let's talk about the Republic, Book 4. This is a very important book. It's very important because Socrates is basically going to define justice for us. He is finally going to give his answer as to what justice is. As you'll remember, we are working on the question of what justice in the city as a whole looks like. So the first thing I want to talk about today is what is justice in the city? The second thing I want to talk about is how Socrates, on the basis of the definition of justice in the city, then tries to show us what justice in the soul is. And as we remember from last week, Socrates is drawing on a metaphor between the city and the soul. The city and the soul are put together in the same ways, and so a just city will be put together in a way that is analogous to, somehow parallel to, that's what those two lines are trying to signal. Justice in the city is parallel to the way that justice appears in the soul. Okay. What kind of thing is justice? So before we say what justice is, let's talk about the broader category of things that justice belongs to. Justice is a virtue or an excellence. Now, we don't use this kind of language all too often in contemporary United States and other countries like it because we have a different way of thinking about morality and ethics. In the contemporary United States, we tend to think about morality in a rule-based way. Our idea is that morality is largely a function of getting our behavior in line with abstract norms or abstract rules. So, for example, one way of thinking about property relations in the United States is to say that there's a rule, there's a prohibition against stealing. And the law tells us, the law is, a kind of rule that the government enforces. The law tells us we should respect other people's properties, and if you want to state it negatively, don't steal. So, on this understanding of morality, it's unjust to steal other people's property because it breaks the rules. And what is justice on this account? Well, if we take the property example, it means respecting other people's property and staying in line with the law. Okay, this notion of justice, it actually comes from this Roman word, jus. Jus is the Latin word typically translated as law. Typically translated as law. So this is one place that the Greeks and the Romans actually differed quite a bit, unlike the case of education where they were very much in line. Okay, so the United States, contemporary United States, really gets its ideas about justice, gets its phrases like the justice system, phrases like criminal justice system, from this rule-based way of thinking about morality. How is Socrates thinking differently? And how is that whole section on moral education more character-based than rule-based? Well, Socrates' idea is virtues like justice aren't so much a matter of staying in line with the rules, acting in a legal rather than an illegal way. Socrates thought of justice as a kind of quality of one's soul. And so instead of making a rule or writing a law that says, don't steal, Socrates would have much preferred that the student learned how to control their desires, how to moderate what it is they wanted. And Socrates' idea is if a student had this virtue or excellence of moderation, they wouldn't want to steal in the first place. They would be properly educated. They would be educated in a moral way. That moral education would bring out the quality or their potential for moderation. And therefore, the law that says don't steal would have been kind of superfluous. So for Socrates, this character-based notion of morality actually goes deeper than the rule-based notion of morality. For Socrates, when morality works on your soul or your insides, that's a deeper foundation for morality than when morality only works on your outward behavior or your external actions. That said, Socrates, of course, realizes that you're going to need laws, especially when moral education fails. At the same time, Socrates thinks moral education is the main thing. Shaping people's characters correctly is the main thing. Writing laws saying don't steal, don't lie, all that would be superfluous if we had the right education system in place. Punishing people because they've broken the law, punishing people because they've done something criminal, that too, according to Socrates, would be superfluous if you could somehow get the right system of education in place. Okay, and you can see Socrates saying something to this effect on page 129, where he's talking about everyday customs, everyday habits. He's talking about things like younger people not talking out of turn in the presence of their elders, giving up their seats for them, standing up for them, looking after their parents, not to mention having their hair cut right, wearing appropriate clothes and shoes, the whole way they carry themselves and so forth. It's silly, I think, this is Socrates speaking, to put all these matters into law. Telling people to do such things or writing them down doesn't make them happen, and they're soon forgotten. So what is the alternative to law? Basically, education. Okay, why do I say this? In the same way that an individual's education is supposed to bring out certain excellences or virtues of their soul, we could say that the education system for a city is supposed to bring out the excellences or virtues of the citizenry as a whole. So you can see here that Socrates is once again drawing on this analogy between the individual and the society, between the psyche, the soul, that's how I've been discussing it, the psyche and the polis, the city state. What is the education system supposed to bring out of the citizenry? Ultimately, it's supposed to bring out the excellence or virtue of justice. The definition of justice is each part does the job for which it is best suited. Okay, so that means justice in the city means each part, each class of people, each group or strata in the city is doing its right job. It's doing the job for which it is best suited. On Plato's Socrates theory of natural ability, that means each part is doing the job for which it is best naturally suited. Okay, and we know the role of education in figuring out who's naturally suited for what. There's basically a meritocracy going on, a sort of slotting by ability. And the overall idea is if each part achieves its excellence, if each part is doing its job well, then the whole city achieves its excellence and the whole city is doing its job well. Okay, so once again, you see here that the relationship between wholes and parts is the key to Socrates' definition of justice. This is all very abstract, so let's try and make it a little more concrete. You remember one of the original proposals as to what justice was came from Cephalus and Polemarchus. And the intuition behind both of their definitions, which I won't repeat here, is that justice means assigning individuals their due or giving individuals their proper share. And so when you refine this idea, when you take the intuition and you shape it up into a formal definition of the kind we see on this slide, the definition of justice, what this amounts to is making sure every individual, by going through this rigorous education system, really knows what they're best suited to do and really knows what job they should be performing for the city. So there's an element of distributing roles or distributing jobs built into this definition of the just city. Okay, what are these roles or what are these jobs? Well, there are basically three. So last week I talked about two, guardians versus non-guardians. At this point, Socrates is now going to distinguish between two kinds of guardians. You'll notice here, side note, that Socrates is really much more concerned with the guardians, their way of life, their education, than he is with everybody else. And Socrates' intuition, you could call it, is that if the ruling group or the leadership of the city has their house in order, then the entire city, they'll have their houses in order. Okay, so he's very focused on what you could call leaders or elites. So within this leadership or guardianship category, you've got two types. You've got the full guardians, and their job is to rule. Their job is to make decisions. Then you've got helper guardians. The translation, we have the Christopher Rowe translation, unfortunately uses an old-fashioned word that nobody really uses anymore. It's auxiliary. Auxiliary just means helping. And it's the helper guardians who are going to help that full guardian class carry out their decisions. And then you've got everybody else. And as we were discussing, the everybody else category is basically the economics category, people who are best suited to do things like banking, do things like trading, do things like growing food, do things like preparing food. do things like, yeah, all the other providing for needs and wants in the city. So there's color coding. There's color coding on this slide. You see here that the first category is gold. The second category is silver. And the third category is, that's supposed to represent bronze and iron. Sorry, I saw the hand. Let's give it a minute. Let me explain this, and then we can break for Q&A. That color coding comes from what our translation calls the myth of metals. And sometimes it's called the noble lie. I much prefer the translation myth of metals because it basically means story about metals. The word myth, remember I was talking about Greek myths and Greek gods a second ago. It comes from the Greek mythos. Mythos basically just means story. Okay, and as you remember, Socrates said, stories have got to contain truth. So Socrates knows that it's not like God's really put gold into the souls of this top rung on the ladder. God didn't put silver into the second rung and bronze and iron into the third rung. However, if you take it as a metaphor, Socrates would say, isn't it true that, at least morally speaking, some people have superior virtue or excellence, and couldn't we represent that as gold in their souls? And the same goes for silver, and the same goes for bronze and iron. Okay, now if that's metaphorically true, this myth of metals is not a lie. I mean, literally, I guess you could say it's a lie because it's not literally true that people have metal in their souls. They don't have metal in their souls. Metal is not one of the things that actually makes up a soul, at least not according to Socrates. But it's allegorically true. It's morally true, Socrates says, that some people have a kind of superior potential for morality. And that's what the metals are supposed to represent. Here is how Socrates thinks the various parts of the city, and parts, remember, are strata or classes, will relate to one another. How the just city will be arranged or organized. So here's the overall picture for the just city. The first thing you'll notice is there are two blue lines. The bigger blue line is the line between guardians and everybody else. And the smaller blue line is between the full guardians and the helper guardians. You'll notice here that one of the things that this pyramid shape implies is that there will be more people in the lowest strata, there will be less people in the middle strata, and there will be the least amount of people in the upper strata. The upper strata, let's call them ruler guardians. This is my terminology, not what's being used in the book, but I think this is actually clearer. The job of these guardians is to rule. The job of these guardians is to say which poems, for example, should go into the curriculum for children. And it's the job of these guardians to say, hey, that that city over there is looking kind of hostile. Should we go to war with them? They make the decisions, ruling as a kind of making laws and ruling as a kind of making decisions. Now, how would you be qualified to make those decisions? You would be qualified by the virtue or excellence of wisdom. And wisdom for Socrates is just a matter of being able to discern between moral things. So a wise person is going to be able to know the difference between just and unjust. A wise person will be able to know the difference between what's beautiful and ugly. A wise person will ultimately be able to know what's the difference between truth and falsity. So wisdom is a kind of judgment, especially a kind of moral judgment, or a kind of ethical discernment. The ability to say the difference between this and that. And that is what a Socrates type of person. So now we're talking about classes of people or types of people and putting them into particular types or classes of functions or jobs. is going to be a Socrates type with full knowledge, full moral knowledge. One rung below that is the helper guardians. So if the top strata is basically a philosopher type, the second strata is basically a warrior or a soldier type. And remember that the warrior's duty is not just physical, but also intellectual. Okay, so the guardians have intellectual ability, they have moral qualification, they are in the same classes with and performing almost as well as the Socrates type, but they're really more like Glaucon and Adeimantus types. They're the type of people who can hang with the Socratic Q&A, but they're not the type of people who would be leading the Socratic Q&A. If you're leading it, you should be leading the city, and you're a Socrates type. If you can understand everything Socrates is saying, if you can, through guiding questions, come to the truth, come to the right conclusions, due to Socrates' superior wisdom, you're a Glaucon type or an Adeimantus type. The primary virtue of this strata, though, is really something more like courage. Courage, and this is what allows this helper guardian to carry out the instructions of the Socrates type, carry out the kind of plans and the decisions that the ruler guardians have for the entire city. So, for example, Glaucon type has to know when to be afraid and when they need to really control their fear. So it's not the idea that you could eliminate fear. Obviously, if there's some huge army charging at you and they may well kill you because you're trying to defend the city, there's going to be some elements of fear and excitement and adrenaline and all that going on. But courage is having the wisdom to know. So you can see here, this is once again the soldier having certain intellectual capacities, having the wisdom to know now is not the time to throw the sword and the spear down and just run. In order to be courageous, you're going to have to basically stand your ground and charge forward or do whatever is appropriate in this situation. And once again, it's not just physical, because it's also intellectual courage that's required. There's a kind of intellectual courage, Socrates would say, to be able to stand up to your fellow citizens when your fellow citizens are corrupt and saying we should basically expand our city-state into some huge empire to go attack other city-states without reason. There has to be a sort of courage to be able to state your conviction, state your moral or ethical conviction that, hey, that's not just. That's not just. So you can see here that there is wisdom in the helper guardian's souls, but it's not the dominant thing. The dominant thing, the primary thing that these helper guardians are going to need is courage. Okay. Now we move into the residual category. Residual just meaning everybody else. Everyone who's not a ruler guardian or not a helper guardian is going to be in this third position. The third position will be occupied by cephalous types with right beliefs. And once again, with the caveat, we're talking about a just city. In a just city, cephalous type will be the kind of bare minimum of moral virtue, the bare minimum of moral knowledge. So you remember the whole point about cephalous is he can do the right thing. He's just not that interested in having a big Socratic dialogue about what justice is. So he will be following the lead, and he will be recognizing the superior excellence and virtue of the guardians. That's one thing that the cephalous type is supposed to do. The other thing that the cephalous type is supposed to do is moderate their desires. And this is why I was talking about moderation earlier. So cephalous, as you'll remember, had the right attitudes towards money and sex. Money and sex are good things. They bring pleasures to the body. They bring a certain sort of satisfaction to life. But is cephalous going to say, yeah, it's great to be a sex addict, or it's great to be obsessed with money? No. It's because cephalous has moderated those basically natural desires for physical pleasure and not allowed them to run amok. And cephalous, with the help of Socrates' types, Cephalus, with the help of Glaucon types, is going to be able to fulfill that function or that achieve that excellence of moderation. Now, you'll notice that moderation is off on the side a little bit, and that's because Socrates doesn't think that you can get any other virtues unless you have moderation first. So think about it like this. If really somebody's desires were immoderate, if they were running amok and they were addicted to sex and money, is there any way that they could really be a good soldier? No, not really, because they would be, instead of training at the gymnasium, they'd be out in the marketplace trying to make better trades or something like that. And instead of doing philosophical dialogues and trying to figure out what the truth is, they'd be off trying to pursue sexual pleasures all the time. Okay, so you've got to have some baseline moderation to get any of the other virtues, including courage and wisdom, going. So that's why moderation is all throughout. All three colors, the gold, the silver, and the bronze, all have moderation. Where is justice in the city? If we had more time, I'd kind of throw this out as a question to the class. You'll notice that Socrates uses the metaphor of a hunting party. You know, you can imagine some hunters out in the woods chasing a game, like a deer or something like this. So it's a kind of spatial metaphor, and the question is, well, where in this just city can we find the virtue or excellence of justice? Let me just cut to the chase, because for reasons of time, this entire diagram is justice. Because you remember, the definition of justice is each part doing the job for which they are best naturally suited. So when we're slotting Socrates into the ruler guardian class, if we're slotting Glaucon into the helper guardian class, if we're slotting Cephalus into the everybody else class, that's justice. And when Socrates is ruling with the help of Glaucon over Cephalus, then we've got justice too, because now each class is performing its function. So it's in the relation between these various parts and the overall city that you find justice. In other words, where's justice in the city? This diagram as a whole represents justice. Okay.